This week on Q&A, author and historian Robert Dallek discusses his latest historical narrative titled Camelot's Court, Inside the Kennedy White House.
Robert Dallek, in your recent book, Camelot's Court, Inside the Kennedy White House, the last paragraph of your entire book, I cannot resist saying thank you to President Barack Obama, who has graciously hosted 4 dinners for presidential historians, where I had a close-up look at what a president hoped he could learn from history. It provided a glimpse into how a president interacted with men and women trying to offer useful judgments on the not entirely different problems earlier presidents, including Kennedy, faced. What's your insight into President Barack Obama because of 4 dinners with him?
Yeah. Well, he's a highly intelligent man. He is keenly interested in history and the way in which the presidential institution has evolved and what he could take away from past presidential performances to make his a more compelling and more successful administration. I wish we had, some extraordinary answers to provide him. But, of course, the nature of history is that it's an imperfect, humanistic enterprise. And he understood this. But we talked about a great variety of things in those interviews or in those dinners. And, of course, there were roughly 12 historians. I wasn't the only one there. And some of his principal aides, including each time one of his principal speechwriters. So for me, it was a fascinating experience to be able to, at one point, sit right next to the president at dinner and have this kind of exchange with him. In many ways, it felt like an academic seminar because, after all, he is someone who has been a professor of law, and it was like being in a seminar with a bunch of colleagues. Was the way I would characterize it.
Did you leave there writing things down after you were there to remind yourself?
Yes,
of what,
indeed. Yes, indeed.
Can you give us an example
of
something?
Well, when we're done with this, which I think we'll have more dinners with him, and one of my colleagues at the dinners and I talked a little bit about writing a piece called Dinners with Obama, you see. But I think it'll be a very positive piece because he listens. He wasn't intent on giving us instruction or lobbying us for anything in particular, except that at the first dinner he wanted to know how presidents achieved the transformative presidency. How did Franklin Roosevelt do it? Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson. How did Ronald Reagan do it with his Reagan Revolution? At the second dinner, because this was in 2010, he was slipping somewhat in the polls and did not have the continuing hold on the public's imagination that he had at the start of his first term. Now, of course, that's not unusual. Once presidents are there for a while, their limitations, flaws are going to be in evidence. But we talked about how to reconnect to the public. And I told him the anecdote about how after Franklin Roosevelt died, and his body was being transported from Warm Springs, Georgia, to Hyde Park, where he was buried, some man stood by the railway track sobbing, and somebody said to the man, "Did you know the president?" And he said, "No, but he knew me." And I related that anecdote to the president. And he nodded. He understood that making that kind of connection to ordinary folks was essential for presidential success. At the third dinner, it was in 2011, and we talked about the coming election, and he was a little more verbal at that point with us, and essentially he said he wasn't concerned about any of the Republicans he was facing. In fact, he said, this fellow Romney has twisted himself into a pretzel, which of course proved to be so accurate a assessment of his candidacy in 2012. And then he talked about the fact that his opponent in the election was the economy. That's what he saw. The last time we had dinner with him was in January of 2013, and almost a year ago, just a year ago now, and he was very upbeat. He had just won re-election. He talked about his State of the Union message, his inaugural speech that he'd be giving, comparisons to other inaugural addresses, especially at second terms, start of second terms. We talked a little bit about the issue of the second term curse, you see, which obviously, given how many difficulties he's struggled with during the course of 2013, one could say, well, there it is again. Now, I don't believe in curses, I don't believe in jinxes or anything like that. And I think it's just inevitable that a president in his second term is going to have a more difficult time than at the start of a first term, because presidents come to office initially on a wave of enthusiasm, excitement, even if they've only won by the narrowest of margins, which was true of John Kennedy. He won by a sliver, and yet very quickly he gained a kind of popularity, kind of approval from the public. But by the start of a second term, people see the fact that a president doesn't walk on water. He's not a miracle worker, as some people like to think at the start of a presidential administration. And it's more difficult for him, and especially if he's dealing with an opposition Congress, as this president has had to deal with.
The subtitle of this book that you just wrote, Inside the Kennedy White House, and you talk about the individuals there. There are still people that we're talking about today. Everybody knows their name that follows history. I wonder if there's anybody in this administration who will be talking about 50 years from now.
Well, that's an interesting question. I think Valerie Jarrett, after all, she's been there through the 5 years, and there's every reason to believe she's going to be there for another 3 years. And so I think some historian is going to want to get her papers, interviews with her if possible, since she, among all the insiders at the White House, probably has been closer to President Obama than any other advisor. So I think she's certainly one name that will register on historians.
Here's a fellow you write about in your book a lot. This is from 1996. He was here for a book notes. Let's watch it.
John Kennedy intended to write his own history of his presidency with my help. And more than once he would refer to me, he would say, in talking to me, he would refer to that book we're going to write. And I always said to him, the book you're going to write, Mr. President, because I didn't have any intention of hanging around his life forever. But when he was suddenly gone and could not write that book, I felt I had some obligation to do it.
How did he fit in the Kennedy White House?
Well, he was, of course, the president's wordsmith. He was a brilliant speechwriter. But he and Kennedy had a kind of symbiotic relationship. I don't mean they were friends. I don't mean that they socialized, because Sorensen said they didn't have that kind of relationship. But there was a kind of intellectual exchange between them, and a kind of intuitive understanding of where this president wanted to go in his administration and what he wanted to say. And Sorensen had the gift of being able to translate that into language that is memorable, you see, because, after all, that some of Kennedy's speeches are going to last, are going to be remembered. What I find so interesting, Brian, is that with John Kennedy, a recent poll asked people to assess the last 9 presidents from Kennedy to George W. Bush. Kennedy came out on top with 85%. During this recent memory of his assassination, the commemoration, 90% approval rating. The only one close to him was Ronald Reagan. And the question any historian has to ask is, why is this the case after all? He was there for only 1,000 days. It was the 7th briefest presidency in American history. And the answer, I think, is that, on the one hand, people don't much like his successors. Johnson with Vietnam, Nixon with Watergate, Ford's truncated presidency, Jimmy Carter's presidency, which people see as essentially a failure. The only one is Reagan. The two Bushes don't register that powerfully.
What about Bill Clinton?
Bill Clinton, yes, but he had the Monica affair. The only president in the country's history, elected president, to have been impeached. See, it's sort of a black mark against his record. Kennedy, of course, dying so young at the age of 46, having only been there for 1,000 days, it's a blank slate on which you can write anything. And he was so young, and the country identifies with that. And they have a sense of loss over, to this day, I think, over his assassination. But he gives people hope. And so what they remember are his words. See, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. His famous peace speech at American University in June of 1963, in which he said, we need to think anew about the Soviet Union. He and Khrushchev had come out of that Cuban Missile Crisis. Nuclear war, so much on the horizon. They were both, I think, frightened, terrified by that experience. And as a consequence, Kennedy wanted to move towards some kind of détente with the Soviet Union. And Khrushchev was receptive to that. That's how you got the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty signed in the summer of 1963. Happened very quickly, you see, because they had been hassling over that for years. And suddenly it occurred. It was a spin-off, I think, from that Cuban Missile Crisis, the terror that they faced over that. I think if Kennedy had lived, we would have seen détente with the Soviet Union more quickly than it came about with Richard Nixon. You see.
You spent a lot of time talking about the individuals around him and people like Mr. Sorensen. And here was the view of Jackie Kennedy in March to June, when they did these interviews with Arthur Schlesinger in 1964. Here's what she said about Mr. Sorensen.
I know one thing about the legislative breakfast that Larry O'Brien told me. This is something interesting about Ted Sorensen. Larry couldn't stand Ted Sorensen. So one night he was telling me, they were obviously, the Irishmen would be jealous of the Sorensens. But he said so many times Larry would have prepared an agenda for the breakfast, and just before they were about to start, Ted would ask to see it and take it. And he'd just change one or two sentences and then initial it TCS and pass it all around that way. And you'll see that heavy hand of Ted Sorensen in more places. I mean, he, wanted his imprint on so many things.
Just self-assertion.
Yeah. I told you about the profiles and courage thing, and he's doing it to Larry O'Brien, everyone. That's just so sneaky.
He was on the whole better in the White House, though, wasn't he?
Oh, yes. But I mean, I just think...
That's such a petty thing to...
Someone said he loved himself, and finally he loved one other person, which was Jack, and he also had such a crush on Jack. I can remember when he first started to try to speak like him, or dare to call him Jack. And he'd sort of blush. And I think he wanted to be easy all the ways Jack was easy. The sort of civilized side of Jack would be easy at dinners, or if girls like you and men. Because he knew he wasn't quite that way in the beginning, it almost went into a sort of a resentment. I mean, it was very mixed up in his own he had a big inferiority complex, so you can see the things sort of all working back and forth.
Mm-hmm.
But, and I never saw him very much in the White House.
Quite critical, said he was in love with himself, talked about profiles and courage, only interested in himself. Is that fair?
I think it's an exaggeration. There's no question that Ted Sorensen was a keeper of the flame. After my personal experience with him, after I revealed the Kennedy medical records, he was the one who signed off. There was a 3-man committee that controlled those medical records, and 2 of the members signed off. And Sorensen was reluctant to do it. I went to see him in New York, met with him in his residence, in his apartment, and persuaded him to let me have access to the records. Well, he didn't know what was in there. And when the records came out, and the New York Times ran a front-page story about my findings, the Atlantic magazine published an article out of my book and on Kennedy's medical history, Sorensen was angry. And when he'd see me, which was a few times after that, he'd say, there was no cover-up. Well, of course there was. I mean, they were hiding from the public the extent of Kennedy's medical history and difficulties. Because if people knew how many medical health problems Kennedy had, I don't think he ever would have been elected in 1960, however unfair that may be, because he acquitted himself brilliantly during the presidency. I set his medical records down alongside of the Cuban Missile Crisis with the tapes we had, and there were no concessions to his medical difficulties during that crisis. Now, it was the medications that helped him, I think, get through it without stumbles. But anyway, to get back to your point about Sorensen, he was a somewhat prickly character, very defensive about Kennedy, as if he were the keeper of the flame. But I don't know why Jacqueline Kennedy was so critical of him. I think she was overly critical in the sense that Sorensen was a total loyalist, and he served Kennedy's needs and desires and wishes to the nth degree. And it wasn't as if he stole thunder from Kennedy. He didn't make claims to having published Profiles in Courage.
Did he or did he not write Profiles in Courage?
Well, that's a complicated story. He did write part of it. There were others who contributed. My research told me, because Kennedy would listen to the tapes of the transcripts of the chapters, and he would edit them. Now, it would be unfair to say that Kennedy was the sole author of Profiles in Courage. On the other hand, it would be unfair to say that he didn't have anything to do with it or had a ghostwriter do it, because he was vitally involved. So it was a combined effort, so to speak. And but I think Mrs. Kennedy was a bit jealous of Sorensen maybe trying to take too much thunder and too much credit, but these are complex relationships that spring up in these White Houses.
By the way, you write on page 2, health problems including Addison's disease, a possible fatal malfunctioning of the adrenal gland is what that is.
Yes.
Chronic back pain that had led to major unsuccessful surgeries, spastic colitis that triggered occasional bouts of diarrhea, prostatitis, urethritis, and allergies had added greatly to the normal strains of the nationwide campaign. You say in this book that Ted Kennedy found out about his brother's, all of his health problems from your book.
Well, not all of them, but I think because he knew that his brother had a medical history and had health problems, but I don't think he knew the full extent, because he was very admiring of my biography, An Unfinished Life, and told me so. And Arthur Schlesinger was as well. Arthur was very kind and said to me, he thinks it's the best biography that's been done of Kennedy. And what both of them concluded was that my description of Kennedy's health problems enhanced rather than undermined his public standing, his reputation in history, because how he managed to rise above his health difficulties and be an effective president was a very impressive achievement. And so they were taken with that. But yes, Ted did not know the full extent of his brother's health problems, and it's the measure of how much they hid it, how much the Joe Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, the president himself, Jackie, they were the ones who knew, but it was largely hidden from the world.
Here's another person that gets a lot of mention in your book, George Ball.
66, because I was tired and broke. I've been there too long. And it was a very exhausting job, believe me. I mean, Dean Rusk destroyed his health by staying there for the balance of the Johnson term. No, I wanted to get out. I mean, it was not just Vietnam, although Vietnam contributed, because it wasn't that I wasn't getting anywhere in my protests, but which is true, but that I couldn't get the president and the people around him interested in any other part of the world.
Outspoken critic of Vietnam, although you say in your book that in the early on times that he was backing basically what they wanted to do in Vietnam in the early years. Can you explain that?
Yeah. Well, he was a loyalist.
What did he do, by the way? I'm sorry.
But he was under Secretary of State, and he replaced Chester Bowles, who Kennedy didn't like having around at all and was trying very hard to get rid of, and finally had to sort of send him on a mission around the world or make him a kind of international diplomat or diplomat going all around the world. Well, he replaced him with George Ball, because Ball was much more of a team player. On the other hand, behind the scenes, Ball was candid with Kennedy about Vietnam in particular. And he told him at one point, Mr. President, if you put 300,000 ground troops into those jungles of Vietnam, you'll never hear from them again. And Kennedy said to him, George, you're crazy as hell. Meaning, I believe, that I'm never going to do that. Now, of course, we'll never know exactly what Kennedy would have done about Vietnam. But on the other hand, when Ball was sort of told to defend the administration, speak for it, that was his job. You know, it's sort of like a vice president. You don't go out on the hustings and give speeches that are in contradiction with what a president is saying. And so he pretty much defended. But behind the scenes, he was candid with Kennedy and was one of those who was a very early critic, along with John Kenneth Galbraith and George Kennan. They warned Kennedy against that. And I don't think Kennedy ever would have done what Lyndon Johnson did in Vietnam. I don't think he ever would have put in 545,000 troops.
Here's an audio recording of John Kennedy right before he was assassinated talking about the Diem coup.
Yep.
The Diem was the president of South Vietnam. Let's listen to this and then get you to interpret this.
Monday, November 4th, 1963. Over the weekend, the coup in Saigon took place. Culminated 3 months of conversation about a coup, conversation which divided the government here and in Saigon. Opposed to a coup was General Taylor, the Attorney General, Secretary McNamara, to a somewhat less degree, John McCone, partly because of an old hostility to Lodge, which causes him to lack confidence in Lodge's judgment, partly as a result of a new hostility because Lodge shifted his station chief. Semicolon, in favor of the coup was State, led by Abel Harriman, George Ball, Roger Hillsman, supported by Mike Forstow at the White House. I feel that we must bear a good deal of responsibility for it, beginning with our cable of early August, in which we suggested the coup. Period, in my judgment, that wire was badly drafted. It should never have been sent on a Saturday. I should not have given my consent to it without a roundtable conference in which McNamara and Taylor could have presented their views.
So what did the United States do in relationship to Diem?
Well, there's no question that they facilitated the coup, but Kennedy's recollections here, what's omitted from it was a discussion of the fact that Diem was assassinated, was killed. And the generals in Vietnam said, well, he had committed suicide. And Kennedy didn't believe that for a moment, because Diem was a good Catholic, and Kennedy said he never, privately said he never would have done that. And I think Kennedy felt a certain amount of guilt over the fact that Diem was assassinated, because he said privately, listen, whatever his failings, he had led his country for quite a few years and done constructive things and was a bulwark against a communist takeover. So he was reflecting on his own recriminations about having allowed such a coup to take place, and also the concern now that the United States was going to have to take greater responsibility for Vietnam than it had taken in the past. And Kennedy was keen to get out of there. And he had a conversation with Mike Forrestal, you see, the day before he went to Dallas, Texas. And he wanted, when he returned, there to be a full-scale review about Vietnam, including the possibility of getting out. See, I don't think he ever would have put in those massive numbers of ground troops. I don't know what he would have done. I don't think he himself knew what he would have done. You know, Brian, I love the anecdote that when he first was first elected, Arthur Schlesinger, Bobby Kennedy asked Arthur if he'd like to be an ambassador, and Schlesinger said, "No, Bobby, if I do anything, I'd like to be at the White House." And a few days later, he saw the president-elect, and Kennedy said to him, "So, Arthur, I hear you're coming to the White House." And Schlesinger said, "I am. What will I be doing there?" Kennedy said, "I don't know, Arthur. I don't even know what I'll be doing there, but you can bet we'll both be busy more than 8 hours a day." The point is, he understood that being president was not a set-piece affair, that it evolved. And he grew in that office. That, in many ways, was his greatest strength. He grew in the office.
I want to read back to you what you wrote in Chapter 8. After 18 months of interactions with his counselors, Kennedy had diminished confidence in most of the men advising him on policy. With the exception of Bobby, who was principally a sounding board and an instrument for testing out ideas on others, he thought it best to rely less on his associates and more on himself for the hard decisions he seemed to be confronting all the time. Neither Dean Rusk, Secretary of State, nor McNamara, Secretary of Defense, nor Bundy, his National Security Advisor, nor Rostow. Oh, no, Rostow was his National Security Advisor.
No, Rostow was under Bundy. Bundy was the National Security. Rostow became National Security Advisor under Johnson.
Nor Taylor, meaning Maxwell Taylor, the general, had impressed him as all that masterful about any of the big issues that he had faced in Cuba, Berlin, or Vietnam.
Right.
That's a strong indictment, it seems to be.
He was someone, as I say, who grew in the office. He was badly burned by the Cuban Bay of Pigs experience. He had listened to the experts, see, CIA, Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he said, and he went to see de Gaulle in France. He did that trip in May, June of 61. And de Gaulle said to him, "You should surround yourself with the smartest possible people. Listen to them, hear what they have to say, but at the end of the day, you have to make up your own mind." And Kennedy remembered what Harry Truman had said, the buck stops here. And I think after that Bay of Pigs, he was absolutely determined to make up his own mind, hear what these experts had to say, weigh what they were telling him, but at the end of the day, he was going to make the judgment, and he was the responsible party. And you see that that was abundantly clear when you listen to all those and read the transcripts of all those tapes during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was his own man. He was the one who was making up his own mind. You know, he held the Joint Chiefs, Taylor, at arm's length. They wanted to bomb, invade, and he didn't want to do it.
We couldn't figure out in your book whether you thought he really liked Maxwell Taylor or he didn't. I know you say he didn't like the Chiefs at all.
Oh, he was very critical of the Chiefs. Very critical.
I mean, they all seem to hate the military.
Well, Taylor, you see, began with a kind of cachet because he was sort of Kennedy's guy, and Kennedy made him the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. But I think over time, the fact that Taylor so much reflected what the Joint Chiefs were saying during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and subsequently about Cuba as well, that Kennedy, I think, became skeptical of him. And I don't know that he would have lasted that much longer into a second term. You know, the anecdote that after the missile crisis was ending, Kennedy had held the Joint Chiefs at arm's length. So he brings them in, and they say to him, Mr. President, you've been had. Khrushchev is hiding the missiles in caves. See, well, they leaked this, the White House leaks this, and Khrushchev wrote Kennedy a note saying, I don't live in the caveman age. In essence, I'm no caveman, see. But the Joint Chiefs, they talk about the need to still plan bombing and invasion, and Kennedy says, well, go ahead, make plans, because you never know what's going to happen, and of course they make all sorts of contingency plans. Part of their plan was to drop a nuclear weapon on Cuba, see, and he thought this was crazy. And they said, oh, the collateral damage, in essence, could be contained. Well, what it would have done to the south coast of Florida, let alone to Cuba, which it would have turned into a pile of rubble. And so he thought they were kind of mad. But, giving them their due, one has to recall that the Joint Chiefs, they came out of World War II, see, and they remembered fighting Hitler, Mussolini, the Japanese military who fought to the bitter end, and their attitude was bomb them back to the Stone Age, which is what they did in Germany and Japan, Tokyo, the fire bombings of Tokyo, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic bombings. So this was their attitude that, who was it, the Thomas Power, the head of Air Forces, said, listen, what's all this concern about nuclear weapons? If at the end of a war with the Soviet Union, there are 3 Americans left and 2 Soviets, we've won. See, so it was this kind of...
This is a small thing, but what do you make then of Bobby Kennedy had 11 children. One of his children is named Matthew Maxwell Taylor Kennedy.
Right. Yeah, well, I think Bobby Kennedy had a great regard for Maxwell Taylor, and he was, in many ways, a revered military figure and someone who they admired because he had resigned from his military position during the Eisenhower presidency because he disagreed with the Eisenhower idea of massive retaliation. And he was the one who spoke for the idea of building up ground forces to combat or counter any Soviet threat in Europe. And that's why they brought him into the White House. The Kennedys brought him into the White House in the first place because he had this opposing view to the idea of massive retaliation, see. And so they appreciated that. But over time, I think, the fact that he was reflecting, because he was in a difficult position. Was he going to come to the White House and say, the Joint Chiefs are all wet, what they're advising you, I think it's not. So more than not, he reflected what they were saying. And I don't think Kennedy found that very appealing at all.
Another man that gets a lot of attention is former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. This was recorded in 1996 on Book Notes. And I know he went on to serve Lyndon Johnson, but let's listen to this and put him in perspective.
November 65, to the press in Saigon, I said it'll be a long war. So, what should I say to the enemy? We're losing? That McNamara, and by the way, my report to the president, which I said in December 65 to him, there's only a 1 in 3 chance, or at best a 1 in 2 chance that we can win militarily. He said, do you mean to say you don't think we can win militarily? I said, yes. Now, that was my report to him. Should I have said that publicly? What do you think? What does your audience think? Now, this is a terrible dilemma. And particularly so when I want to tell you that I was in a very small minority. And I'm not saying I was right. Other people thought then, and many think today, that we were winning then. And as I've suggested, some people think today we were winning then. It was the press that caused us to lose. That is baloney.
Your book's full of American leaders and generals going into Vietnam and coming back and saying, we're winning, we're winning, we're winning. No one came back ever and said we're not winning. What do you think of that?
Well, I knew McNamara a little bit. I interviewed him a couple of times. And the first time I interviewed him, I began by asking him about Vietnam. He said, I'm not going to talk about that. This was prior to 1998 when I was working on my second Lyndon Johnson volume, Flawed Giant. Within 15 minutes, all he could talk about was Vietnam. See, he was profoundly conflicted about Vietnam. Now, during the Kennedy presidency, he was the biggest advocate of exercising muscle in Vietnam, asserting our authority, our power. And the journalists, like David Halberstam, who raised questions with him, he was dismissive of them, even contemptuous, And so, sure, he eventually came to the proposition that this was a military no-win situation in Vietnam. But he had been so arrogant about leading us to that war, and I think that's what agitated him so much. And where he says, you think I could say in public that we only had a 1 in 2 or 1 in 3 chance of winning, you see? Well, the point is he eventually got out of the Johnson administration. Johnson saw him sort of having almost a nervous collapse over his struggle over Vietnam, and they sent him off to be president of the World Bank. But he was a man who was profoundly conflicted, but only over time. He was one of the architects of expansion, a larger war in Vietnam. The biggest hawk was Walt Rostow. Rostow became Johnson's national security advisor. Rostow, during the Kennedy presidency, was already talking about bombing Hanoi and Haiphong and putting ground troops in there. And he never gave up on that war. I knew Rostow as well, talked to him, interviewed him, knew him when I would go to the Johnson Library of Texas. And his attitude was, we saved the other Southeast Asian countries. We gave them time to develop. That was his rationale. The same thing from William Westmoreland. We gave them time to develop.
Page 329, there's a juxtaposition in one long paragraph, and it gets back to the image of the president and whether or not, if we'd have known he was that sick, would he have been elected. This is another one of these that if we'd have known this, what would we have thought? Jackie Kennedy reflected the depths of their fears when she told her husband that she and the children wanted to die with him. This was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yeah. If it came to that, despite her reluctance to leave, he was sending her out to the country or someplace away from the White House. He sent her and the children away to the safety of a bomb shelter. Then you write, he then invited Mimi Beardsley to spend the night of October the 27th with him at the White House. She witnessed Kennedy's grave expression and funereal tone that evening when he told her that, quote, I'd rather my children be red than dead. And Mimi Beardsley was who?
Well, she was a 20-year-old intern who Kennedy began having an affair with in the summer of 1962. And he had a sustained relationship with her to the end of his life. She saw him the week before. She describes in her book how she saw him the week before he went off to Texas. And she claims in her book that he said to her, well, I wish I could take you with me to Dallas, but I can't. Well, of course he couldn't, because Jackie Kennedy was going on the trip with him. And he had this relationship with her in which they were vitally tied to one another. In a way, it was, a really curious business. And there was something bizarre almost about this. After all, he was a 45-year-old man, president of the United States. He had relationships with women galore, see? Why did he have to seduce this 20-year-old kid? Now, she doesn't complain in the book about this.
Her book.
In fact, she wrote me a note saying she thanked me for having brought this information forward in my first book in 2003, because she had carried this as a secret, and her book is called Once Upon a Secret. And she said also in her note to me that that's how she met her second husband, because of this story coming out. And I never met her, but we corresponded. We had, it seems like a very nice, intelligent woman.
How did you find the story in 2003?
Well, I had read in the Kennedy Library an oral history by a woman named Barbara Gamarikian, who was the deputy press secretary at the Kennedy White House under P.S. Salinger. And I happened to meet her at a cocktail party here in Washington. And I said to her, Barbara, I've just read your oral history in the 17 blacked out pages. And she agreed to let me in them. Well, when I read them, this is what she revealed, that Kennedy had this affair with this 20-year-old. And then all I had was 38 words, 2 lines in my biography in 2003 about this issue. And I wasn't intent on making a big deal out of this. What interested me about it was the fact that I had interviewed a number of journalists for that biography. And I asked them, did you know about Kennedy's womanizing? They said, yes. Oh, we suspected. Why didn't you write about it? You didn't do it in the 1960s. You didn't intrude on a president's private life in that way. And so it was hidden from the public. Well, when I brought this forward, the press got on to this, and the New York Daily News, a reporter called me up, and they said, who's this woman? I didn't know who she was, and Barbara didn't want to tell me. And I trusted what Barbara was telling me and had written and said in her oral history, and I didn't want to know. I said, this woman must be in her 60s. Leave her alone. Why, she doesn't want to bring it out. Why should I? Anyway, they found out who she was. Good investigative journalism, I guess you could say. And she then was sort of all over the place. And the New York Daily News for 3 days in a row ran front-page stories about Kennedy's Monica. It was the time of the Monica Lewinsky business. And in the first day they had the story on page 3, they had a picture of Monica Lewinsky and of me. As I said to my wife, I never even met the woman.
Well, here's the NBC interview with Meredith Vieira, just a little bit of it, with Mimi Beardsley a couple of years ago.
And the last room that we went into was a bedroom.
It was Jackie Kennedy's bedroom.
I learned later that it was Mrs. Kennedy's bedroom. It was blue, pale blue, I remember. I felt the president getting closer and closer to me. Looked me right in the eyes, and I actually, he then put his hands on my shoulders and sort of guided me down to the edge of the bed, sort of the corner of the bed. And I think he may have even said to me, is this all right? Are you okay? Is this okay? I don't really think I knew what he was talking about. What I felt was, is what okay? I didn't really know what was about to happen. And then what did happen was I lost my virginity right there. I think I went a little bit into shock.
Why did she write the book, do you think, and go through all the details about their relationship over an 18-month period, and she flew around the country, available to him at the end of the day?
Yeah. It is so interesting, Brian, because when I first published my book, and the story came out about her, and the New York Daily News revealed her name and who she was, I heard on the grapevine that a publisher offered her $1 million to write her book, a memoir. And it wasn't until, 8 years later that she finally did it. So I never asked her. I don't know why she did it. Maybe she needed the money. I suspect they still were willing to pay her because it really was very much a tell-all book. And, of course, some of the details she reveals are somewhat shocking,
But go back to when I read the 2 paragraphs. Jackie Kennedy has great fears about her husband. She wants to keep the children and herself around him in case they die. And then in the next page, he's, on October the 27th, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, is going upstairs to her bedroom, Jackie Kennedy's bed, and bedding down this 19-year-old or 18-year-old, whatever she was. What are we as the public? Does this really not matter to the public?
It 2 ways you can look at this, Brian. On the one hand, did it have an impact on his conduct to the presidency? As far as I can tell, no. I mean, was he going to be found out? Was he going to be impeached? Not in 1962, 63. As I said, the press did not write about a president's, at least the mainstream press did not write about a president's private life in that way. But it says something about the man's character, about his personality, about the fact that there was some kind of deep felt neediness that this man had, that he had to seduce this 19, 20-year-old young woman. I mean, and it's not just that, but her description of some of the things that went on, oral sex, that he encouraged her to give oral sex to Dave Powers, Kennedy's principal aide.
And his brother.
And his brother, but she resisted when he suggested that she perform oral sex on Ted Kennedy. But with Dave Powers, she did it. And she said Kennedy watched. He later apologized to them. But, what word can you apply to it? Perverse? I mean, there's something...
Here's Arthur Schlesinger, who wrote the book 1,000 Days, I believe, and
yes.
Right after the presidency, he was his historian, and here's what he said he knew about the dalliances of JFK.
I mean, the current theory seems to be that everyone in Washington knew about a parade of bimbos through the White House, and that they covered up because they liked Kennedy or because the rules deflected that kind of inquiry. You read Ben Bradley's book. Ben Bradley was Jack Kennedy's closest friend in the press. As head of the Newsweek Bureau, he was at the nerve center of news gathering there. Ben Bradley writes that he did not know about these things. I certainly was not aware of any kind of waywardness which would interfere with the conduct of public business.
You believe that?
Well, the journalists I talked to, including Bob Novak, said they suspected. They had clues. They thought there were lots of women coming and going from the White House. And in fact, in my first biography, a journalist told me the story that when Kennedy was on the campaign trail in 1960, he was in Northern California. There were a bunch of pom-pom girls from the local college. Kennedy pointed to one of them. His aide went up to this young woman and said to the senator would like to see you in his hotel room. She went up there. And the story the journalist told me, how he knows this exactly, I don't know, is that maybe this young woman told him. But the journalist told me that Kennedy said to this young woman, he looked at his watch and said, well, we have 15 minutes. Now, what happened after that, the journalist didn't say. But the point is, sure, they knew, they suspected. And but
is the important point then, as you said earlier, that whether it's this president or any president, and whether we knew or didn't know, is whether or not it had an impact on the presidency? Is that the only thing we have to worry about?
Well, I think that certainly is a central proposition. This certainly is between him and his wife as to what their relationship is like and whether the president is a philanderer or not. But, in this day and age, it seems to me that it would be madness for a president to try and do this because it's a different world from what it was in the 1960s. So they would be, it would be brought forward. It would be all over the press, all over the television, and would probably destroy the man's presidency. You see, so but it was a different time in the 1960s. I'm not justifying it. I mean, I think that it was terribly excessive as to what he did with this young woman. On the other hand, I'm also someone who, I'm not a Puritan, and I'm not saying that, my God, he should have just been loyal to Jackie. I mean, that was between them. Now, she knew about this. She knew he was a philanderer. And there was the anecdote that they were up in Canada, and they were in a receiving line, and there was a military aide standing next to a White House military aide. And she said to him in French, who this man understood French, it's not enough I come to Canada and stand in line, and one of these bimbos was in line to shake her hand. And she was furious at this situation. And who can blame her? See,
Dean Rusk was Secretary of State, and You have this quote. I just wanted you to give some background on this. Rusk had been a cautious but steady presence throughout the discussion. He described his function as trying to, quote, keep the group from moving too far or too fast. Bobby Kennedy privately described him as, quote, playing the role of the dumb dodo for this reason. Yeah. Did he think he was a dumb dodo?
Well, he didn't really think he was a dumb dodo, but he saw Rusk that his personality was such that he was very deferential to the president on making a foreign policy. But I think there's a mixed assessment here in the sense that this is what Kennedy wanted. He didn't want a Secretary of State who was going to vie with him and compete with him on the making of foreign policy. The Kennedy administration was a foreign policy administration. Kennedy was not that interested initially in domestic affairs. He was dragged, so to speak, kicking and screaming into dealing with civil rights. And when he dealt with it, I think it was quite courageous of him to put that civil rights bill before the Congress in 1963, because it could have jeopardized his reelection, since he knew he was going to be alienating southern states, southern voters. And they had put him across in 1960. He didn't know he was going to run against Goldwater. He thought he might well be running against him, but he didn't know for sure. And so it was courageous of him to do that. He felt time had come. As I said, he grew, he evolved in that office. But he was very much a foreign policy president, and I don't think he wanted a Secretary of State who was going to be aggressive about challenging what he wanted to do in the conduct of foreign affairs. What Kennedy complained about was that Rusk didn't have ideas. He was not someone who came forward with suggestions that Kennedy might have used, that he had little imagination in dealing with foreign policy. And that was, I think, a legitimate complaint.
Your first trip here was in 1991 when you wrote a book on Lyndon Johnson, and here you are in 1991, a number of years ago.
Some of the things I've already found, for example, about his presidency is that he was trying to use the FBI to get certain journalists and work against Paul Newman, the movie actor, who was advocating Johnson's impeachment in 1967 over Vietnam. And Johnson is trying to get the FBI to go after Paul Newman to see what they can find to use against him. So, I mean, he was could be ruthless, and I suspect if these things were known at the time, he could have been impeached and driven from office.
How many books on Lyndon Johnson?
2 volumes, and then I did it for Oxford University Press, a compressed one volume. But yeah, two big volumes of Lone Star Rising and Floor Giant. 1998 was the second volume.
This may be an unfair question for you. I'm not sure you're allowed to ask these kind of questions. What's the difference between your take on Lyndon Johnson and Robert Caro's?
Well, I think my attempt in my Johnson work was to strike some kind of balance, and I feel that way still about Johnson. You know, this poll I cited before, where Kennedy has an 85% approval rating, Johnson has only a 49% approval rating. He's third from the bottom. We're coming up now to the anniversary of the War on Poverty, the Great Society. Johnson did some extraordinarily constructive things for this country. Sure, we didn't abolish poverty as he wanted to, but he certainly eased the plight of people, and he took another step forward from where the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt were in humanizing the American industrial system. And I think that's to be admired and applauded, because he was ruined by Vietnam. And that's the shadow that continues to hang over his reputation. I don't know what Mr. Caro is going to say about the Johnson presidency, you see. He's just reaching that point in writing about the Johnson presidency. But I think Caro has evolved in time over his picture of Johnson. You know, in the beginning there was some very, very critical writing about Johnson, particularly when he ran against Coke Stevenson in that 1948 Senate campaign, and I think he's become more I don't know what word to use, receptive or gentle in his criticism of him, and of course his volumes are beautifully written. They are a model of how to engage a general audience, you see. But I'll be very curious to see what his presidential volumes, plural, turn out to be.
Born in Brooklyn, went to the University of Illinois to get your undergraduate degree in history, PhD and a master's from Columbia. I wrote down the places you've taught in your life.
Yep.
Boston University, Columbia, Oxford, UCLA for how many years?
30 years.
On campus in
yep.
LA?
Yep.
Caltech?
Yep.
University of Texas, Dartmouth, now teaching at Stanford?
I teach for Stanford University in Washington. I teach a course on the presidency, a seminar. I looked at that picture. Who was that handsome young fellow you had on camera there?
This is 23 years ago. Son Matt, what's he do?
My son Matthew has earned a bachelor's degree from Berkeley, PhD in modern American political history from Columbia. He became a speechwriter, was Richard Gephardt's speechwriter for, I think, 2.5 years. Currently, he's a full-time faculty member for the University of California in Washington. They have a big Washington center on Rhode Island Avenue, and he teaches full-time for them. He published an excellent book on Ronald Reagan called The Right Moment, and he's finishing a book he will call Eat War, Sleep War, Think War, Franklin Roosevelt's Civil Defense. And it's about Roosevelt's civil defense in 1940 to 44.
Where did you meet Jerry Dallek?
In California, in Los Angeles.
How long have you been married to her?
It'll be 49 years this year.
And what did she do? What did she do when you met her?
She became a health policy analyst, and she headed a nonprofit in Los Angeles called the Center for Healthcare Rights, dealing with Medicare and Medicaid. And when we moved to Washington, it was because of her job offer. She worked for something called Families USA, heading their policy department, and then she went to a institute at Georgetown where they did health policy analysis. So she had a long career in health policy.
You've written 14 major works, including the one that we've been talking about, and I look at the list out front. Of all those, one on Harry Truman, Nixon, Kissinger, LBJ, John F. Kennedy, Franklin Roosevelt, and then the book on William Dodd.
Right.
It's the same book that Garden of Beasts that Eric Larson did. Not the same book, but same subject matter.
Right.
Which one of these did you have the most fun writing?
Well, I think in some ways maybe the most fun was Kennedy, because I did get into such interesting, in some ways startling, new information. But Franklin Roosevelt, I found that fascinating because he is a fascinating character, and I'm now going to go back to FDR, and I'm been invited by the Viking Penguin Press to write a big one-volume life of FDR, and so I'm 79 years old. My health is good, and I've told my doctor, you got to keep me going for another 4 or 5 years so I can get this FDR book done.
When do you intend on having it finished?
Well, I hope it'll take me no more than 4 or 5 years.
Which of these books, and we only have 30 seconds, which of these books was the hardest to write?
Well, the early ones. The first book on Dodd was my doctoral thesis. I didn't know if I could write a book. This was I was a novice at this. And then doing the big FDR book, if I were going back to that original FDR book, which I did on foreign policy, I would have done it in somewhat different ways. Some of the detail I would have taken out.
All these books still in print?
Yes, they are.
And if you read Garden of Beasts by Eric Larson,
yep.
Would you learn something in addition to that if you read your dissertation on William Dodd?
Yeah, absolutely, because his book only takes Dodd's ambassadorship through roughly the first year and a half, and mine goes through the whole ambassadorship. Of course, he has a great deal about Martha Dodd, the daughter, who in many ways was more interesting than the father, and I didn't focus on the daughter.
We've been talking about a book called Camelot's Court Inside the Kennedy White House. Our guest has been Dr. Professor Robert Dallek. We thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure to be with you again, Brian.
For free free transcripts, or to give us your comments about this program. Visit us at Q&A.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.